Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We are here in New York today, but that doesn't mean that there's any shortage of things emanating from Washington to talk about. You've got a tariff ruling on the one hand that, at least for now, has limited the president's ability to enact the full sweeping nature of his tariff policy. On the other hand, President Trump is not just focused on trade today, but also on a meeting that just happened at the White House we've just learned about. The first time since Donald Trump's second term began that he sat down in person with the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, knowing that Jerome Powell is not always called that, at least if President Trump is the one speaking. Too late is the nickname. He uses Mr. Too late. I don't know if that gets used anywhere outside of True Social for face-to-face interaction or not. But what we do know, according to a statement from the Fed, is that Chairman Powell made it clear that decisions of the Fed will be made, and this is a quote, based solely on careful, objective, and non-political analysis, Joe.
Therefore, too late. If you ask the president of the United States to be a fly on the wall. We want to learn as much as we can about this right now. We're just on the precipice of the White House press briefing about to begin with Secretary Karoline Leavitt. Just outside the doors of the briefing room, we find Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. What do we know about this meeting, Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. So we're still waiting for additional details, but the Federal Reserve has confirmed that this was on President Trump's invitation that the Fed Chair Jerome Powell came here to the White House today. And they said that they did not discuss expectations for monetary policy and that any future path of policy is going to be data dependent, as we often hear from the Fed Chair. And Kailey read this quote, but it's probably worth repeating. They said that any decision will be based on, quote, careful, objective, and non-political analysis. Now, of course, President Trump has said that he has no intentions of firing Jerome Powell, but ultimately we know he's been heaping on the criticism in recent weeks that he would like to see the FOMC ultimately cut rates. And even as he does pile on this criticism, of course, it comes amid his tariff plans. President Trump often says that his tariff plans will go hand in hand with lower interest rates, but they're defined by just so much uncertainty, which the administration says is strategic, but of course makes Jerome Powell's job harder as it puts him in between a rock and a hard place when it comes to inflation and any expectations of weaker growth. Now, interesting enough, we did hear from Chicago Federal Reserve Bank President Austin Goolsbee today, who said that if big tariffs could be avoided, whether that be through deals or potentially a court order, ultimately that could pave the way for the central bank to cut interest rates, given the underlying strength of the economy and the direction of inflation.
Well, Tyler, let's talk more about the president's tariff policy, which was dealt a blow in court yesterday as the judges unanimously ruled that IEEPA and the way he was trying to use it is not applicable for his sweeping tariffs. The administration obviously appealing that decision. But what comes next in terms of his pursuit to enact these levies on trading partners?
Right, Kailey. So the administration really earlier this morning saying that they are prepared to take this fight to the Supreme Court. They are appealing it, and they say if they are not given immediate temporary relief when it comes to this ruling, then they could take this to the Supreme Court for emergency relief as soon as tomorrow. Now, at the heart of this ruling is that the U.S. Court of International Trade ultimately decided that the administration didn't correctly invoke IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, when they put forward their reciprocal tariffs. The White House had been arguing that persistent trade imbalances amounted to a national emergency, but the court said that that didn't really meet their definition, their justification for an unusual or extraordinary threat as outlined in the law. The administration, though, is really pushing forward here, and we heard from senior trade advisor Peter Navarro on Bloomberg television earlier today, who said they still have some levers they could pull.
We think we have a strong case, yes. We will immediately appeal and try to stay the ruling. But at the same time, the court, interestingly enough, basically said we were right, just use different rules and laws. So nothing has really changed here in that sense. We're still, as we speak, having countries call us and tell us they want a deal.
So Joe and Kailey, keep in mind that this ruling extends to the so-called reciprocal tariffs. It also extends to those other instances where this White House has invoked IEEPA, including for tariffs on Mexico and Canada, as well as China. It does not extend to those sector-specific tariffs that have been invoked under Section 232 on the grounds of national security concerns.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House for us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. And we want to hear a little bit more from Peter Navarro, who Tyler just pointed out, the trade advisor at the White House, who had an extended conversation about these policies on Bloomberg surveillance earlier today, also digging in specifically to the justification around IEEPA. This is what else he told our colleagues.
There's no question that there's an economic emergency with respect to both uses that we had. One is we are in a world where China has killed over 1 million Americans with fentanyl poison, and we took this step to stop that. We will continue to press on that. At the same time, we invoked that rule to stop what has been 20 million illegal aliens streaming into our country, driving down wages, taking jobs away. That's an economic emergency.
So he says there's no question about this being an economic emergency, but we want to get another opinion now and turn to Greta Peisch, partner at Wiley Rein, also former general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Greta, welcome back to Balance of Power. I wonder if you are surprised by this ruling, if you think the administration has a point that actually there was justification for the president to use this authority, and how you think ultimately the Supreme Court might come down on this if indeed it escalates to that level.
Well, the thing about this case is that it is such uncharted territories. And I think that this has been a theme for the administration. They're really pushing authorities in the trade space beyond what they have been used for before. This was true in the first Trump administration, and it's true now. And that really makes the outcomes of these cases a bit unpredictable, which is maybe why we see such surprise today of the outcome that came out of the CIT. But there's going to be a lot of twists and turns to come with the motions for stays to hold the order, both at the lower court, also at the Court of Appeals, potentially going to the Supreme Court tomorrow. So, I think we don't know where this path is going to take us, but I think there's going to be twists and turns along the way.
Well, isn't part of the story here, Greta, that nothing actually is going to change? If this White House is seeking a stay, then pretty much everything stays in place. You add Section 122, Section 232, we're all apparently experts on this stuff now, that the White House feels like it has a pretty strong hand beyond the emergency argument, that when it just comes to basic procedure, they're going to keep doing what they're doing.
I think that's right. I think that's what you heard from Peter Navarro. I think that would be consistent with the direction of the president's given and the importance he's put on this policy and the reasons behind it. So whether they prevail in the courts and are able to keep these tariffs in place, or if they have to look to another tool like Section 122, we just keep adding numbers to our number basket for tariffs. Yes, I think that you would say there's likely to be a continuation of this policy in one form or another.
So does it become then just a question of the timing it actually takes to enact the policy, Greta? Because if you need full investigations in order to use some of these authorities, that would suggest that he can't necessarily find ways to reimpose tariffs on trading partners by July 9th, for example, when the deadline for negotiations on trade deals is supposed to be.
Right. Well, every trade authority has pluses and minuses. And IEEPA, the authority that has been, its use has been struck down, it's very flexible and very fast. And so that made it very attractive for the administration to use. And other authorities do have drawbacks. Some of them, as you say, require investigation. That's the case with Section 232, these sector-specific tariffs like steel, aluminum, autos, and there's a number of other ongoing investigations. That's true of Section 301, which is the authority that was used to put tariffs on China in the first Trump administration. Now, there's a new authority that was actually cited in the case in the order pausing or invalidating the IEEPA tariffs. 122. This is a balance of payments, balance of trade authority that hasn't been used before doesn't require an investigation. So that could go on pretty quickly. Now, the downside there is it only lasts for 150 days, and you can only go up to 15% in the tariff level. So again, drawbacks, you have speed without authority, but there's limitations on its use.
Much has been made, Greta, of the fact that we got a ruling from judges appointed by Barack Obama, Donald Trump himself, and Ronald Reagan. And I want to turn you into a legal analyst for the purposes of this conversation, but how are you reading into that?
I don't read too much into it. It's the Court of International Trade. These are experts on trade authorities. They come at it from a particular perspective. They've dealt with many of these authorities many times and thought about the delegation of tariff authority from Congress to the executive branch and what the contours of that may be. I mean, I think it's more about, to me, this court and how it thinks about these authorities than maybe the particular people who were on the panel in this case.
What do you think this means, Greta, for negotiations that are still ongoing between the U.S. and trading partners? Is there a material amount of leverage lost here if Trump and his proxies in the administration who are negotiating on his behalf can't say, look, if you don't agree to this, we're just slapping X tariff on you? If they don't necessarily have that power because the courts have said that they don't, does that substantially weaken the United States' hand?
I don't view it necessarily as a big change. And there's two things going on. One, for example, for the UK, the concessions they received were around not the tariffs that have been struck down yesterday, but around the 232 tariffs on autos, on steel, aluminum, on a potential pharmaceutical tariff action. And so many countries are still interested in those tariffs. And then again, I think there is the prospect of the administration using other tools to impose tariffs. And it's not just 122 and these 10 or 15% tariffs, but could they launch a Section 301 investigation with respect to particular countries and put in place the prospect of even higher tariffs? It's a possibility. And so, I think that trading partners are going to take a beat to assess the situation, what they're hearing from the administration, from Peter Navarro today, from the press secretary, from the president himself. But I think they're going to probably take the view that, the administration, the president's going to continue to pursue this policy and that they're going to have to operate under those parameters.
This is a court that not many people had ever heard of. I think before this story, when you're working in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, how often are you interacting with the CIT, the Court of International Trade?
Well, it is the court that the trade agencies interact with. So any statute, so for example, Section 301, it's another tariff statute. There has been litigation ongoing since the first Trump administration. Was ongoing when I was at the U.S. Trade Representative's office that was before the CIT, and it is that court of first instance that every tariff action goes to. So for those in the trade sphere, it's not obscure. It's where all of our cases and controversies funnel through.
And finally, Greta, we just have a minute left here, but knowing President Trump in recent weeks has said if negotiations with partners don't go well, that the U.S. is just going to set a tariff rate, tell countries what it costs to do business with the United States. Unless he pursues one of these other authorities, should we assume that he, in fact, isn't going to be able to do that in these weeks, that he won't have the authority to do so?
Well, it may be difficult for him to do so. There is an even more obscure statute called Section 338, which also has not been used and has been, it talks about unfair practices, discrimination. That's another potential tool. There's a lot of questions about the process to invoke it. So, never say never, but it will certainly be a challenge. And the president and the administration may need to jump through some hoops, do some work to fulfill the requirements of these statutes in order to follow through with that. But again, I think that the specter of higher tariffs, can be put in place immediately, even if it ends up being delayed in impact.
Because it can always be more obscure. We have Greta Peich. Thank you, Greta, so much for walking us through all of this. Partner at Wiley Ryan, former general counsel, the Office of the USTR. And Kailey, we do have a headline coming out of the news briefing at the White House. Not a shock to be hearing from Karoline Leavitt today, is it?
No, and perhaps not a shock what she's saying either. She says the Trump administration saw another example of judicial overreach using his full and proper legal authority, hence the appeal. We'll have more next here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The fastest show in politics on Bloomberg TV and radio as we keep our eyes and ears on a White House briefing that's underway right now. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt talking about the federal court ruling on tariffs that we've been discussing, as well as the meeting that we just during the program learned about between President Trump and Fed Chair Jay Powell. Kailey, the headline says it all. Trump told Powell in person the Fed is making a mistake on the rate call. We know that Donald Trump wants rate cuts. We know that the Fed does not see the conditions for them. My only question at this point is whether he called Jay Powell too late, his nickname for the Fed chair.
Yeah, I wonder if that one gets thrown around face to face. We do know, according to a statement from the Fed, though, that Chairman Powell didn't seem to indicate to the president that the Fed feels like it's making a mistake, not lowering interest rates, making it clear, according to their statement, to quote it directly, that those decisions are made based solely on careful, objective, and non-political analysis. We also should point out here, this is the first time these two have met in person since Donald Trump assumed the presidency for a second time. For all of the kind of vitriol that the president has thrown at Jerome Powell on social media or in various briefings, he hadn't actually had this conversation with him directly until today.
It's a day like this you wish you could talk to Patrick McHenry.
Good thing we can here on Bloomberg TV and radio. The former chairman of the House Financial Services Committee and now Bloomberg Politics contributor is with us from Washington, D.C. Mr. Chairman, we've obviously talked with you extensively before about the feelings the president has about the rate policies of the Federal Reserve. Meetings like this aren't necessarily unusual. The chairman has made it very clear he would never initiate a conversation with the president unless the president asked him to, which is what we understand happened here. But telling the Fed chair in person that he's making a mistake, do you expect that actually changes his decision making?
No, but I think it's also this is not unprecedented for the president and the Fed chair to meet. It is rare, yes. But I think what the president is saying publicly and what he said privately are matching up quite simply. The president has a very different view of inflation, has a very different view of Fed rate setting policy than does the Open Markets Committee and the chair of the Federal Reserve. And so for the president to air those his views and those concerns, I think it's fine to do. I don't think that changes the Fed policy setting. I don't think it changes the inclination of the members of the Open Markets Committee to change course here. But it also is an opportunity for the president to highlight in our political discourse his difference of opinion and his separate view of inflation and rate-setting policy.
Well, we owe it to the White House, Congressman, and the press secretary to deliver the line in full. What she said was, President believes the Fed chair is making a mistake by not lowering interest rates, which is putting us at an economic disadvantage to China and other countries. Jay Powell would tell you that we're at an advantage because we're not knee-jerk changing interest rates, and we're trying to create conditions for growth. How do you see it?
Well, I think that is, in fact, the case. I think the Open Markets Committee is using the best information that they can. I do think when the president has a critique of the Federal Reserve that they changed policy too slowly during the Biden administration. They did not raise rates at a fast enough clip to curtail inflation, and they were too late. In fact, I think Chairman Powell has said as much publicly. But right now, I think what the most important thing for us to do is get inflation in check. There's a lot of turmoil, obviously, with tariff policy. There's a lot of uncertainty with the current tax code expiring and a massive tax increase going into effect at the end of the year. And then an open question about whether or not we're paring down our federal budget spending enough and paring down the deficit enough to match what the Treasuries market is trying to tell us, that we're spending too much and our debt is too high. So there's a lot to react to and respond to. But I don't think the Federal Reserve is off base at waiting for more information.
Well, you allude to what the Treasury market is trying to say, and a former member of the House Financial Services Committee under your leadership, still one. In fact, Republican Congressman Byron Donalds was with us on this program yesterday and also called out the bond market specifically. This is what he told us.
I look at the bond market, and one thing is crystal clear. The bond market is looking at the United States, and they are saying, you better get your fiscal house in order, or we're going to charge you more to borrow money. No nation can thrive under that kind of a scenario. So we have to be serious on Capitol Hill.
And he went on to tell us, Mr. Chairman, that he actually hopes the Senate pursues steeper spending cuts in its version of the bill now that it's in its hands. The question is whether whatever the Senate passes can get through the House once more. Are you expecting that the Senate is going to address this in a materially different way?
No, but I think what the bond market is screaming at Congress about is to cut down on spending. The fact is, the one big beautiful bill that they're discussing, the reconciliation bill that they're debating, is in essence continuing the current tax code that we have today and extending it into next year and for the coming years. That's not a tax cut. What they're doing is avoiding a tax increase. Mm-hmm. There are some pro-growth policies in there that cost additional revenue to the federal government, yes, in the short term. There's a few new things like the political discourse on tax and tips, taxing tips, Social Security benefits, a few of those things the president talked about, and the necessity to pass the bill out of the House, which was changing the SALT deduction. Those things are all costly, yes. But in substance, the tax part of this thing is taking the current code and extending it. What the bond market is saying is that the cutting side, where you're getting federal savings, federal budget savings, is not enough. And so let's put that in context. What the House just passed was over 10 years about $900 billion to $1 trillion of spending cuts. 2 years ago, at this time, we negotiated, Garrett Graves, on Speaker McCarthy's behalf, negotiated with the White House for a spending reduction package to raise the debt ceiling. That resulted in $1.5 trillion of savings over 10 years. So for all Republican majorities in the House and the Senate and the White House to pare down spending by $900 billion doesn't stand up to what President Biden did at the bequest of Republicans. So that's small. And that doesn't even compare to what Republicans got put in place under Obama, Speaker Boehner did under Obama, which resulted in $2.1 trillion of savings over 10 years. So this is a small spending cuts package. Congress needs to listen to that, and I think Byron Donalds is right here.
Well, that's incredible perspective, and I appreciate your walking us back through that, Congressman. What does it tell you then when you hear, Byron Donalds is no shrinking violet. If he's hoping the Senate finishes the job and couldn't get it done in the House, then who can?
That's exactly the case here. And I think the high water mark for spending cuts comes out of the House, not out of the Senate. The tax policy change, I think what we're looking at is a narrower bill that makes it through the rules process in the Senate. A narrower bill that has less cost savings to the federal taxpayer and actually pares down the policy included that actually will reduce spending over time. That is not a good thing, and I think that's a big concern that the bond market is telling policymakers to look have a tougher look at.
Well, especially if you consider that part of this fiscal picture was supposed to be tariff revenue as well, which maybe isn't going to be quite as robust in the aftermath of this ruling from last night on IEEPA. Mr. Chairman, I do wonder your reaction if you buy the administration's argument here that this court is wrong, that using those emergency economic powers is indeed justified in all of these cases.
Well, I think there are a number of they have a number of authorities under tariff policy in the broader tariff policy basket that they can utilize. They may have referenced the wrong act in order to take the actions they've had, but the president has broad authorities on tariffs, and I think that this president will take those broad authorities and get a better court ruling using perhaps different pieces of law. But I think the tariff policy here and the president's actions here will stand, but I think they've got to do a better job of justifying where they derive their power and in the utility of that law.
Patrick McHenry, the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act has been introduced. I'm not sure what you think of the name here, but we've been talking a lot about a market structure bill going back to when you were running the committee. Based on the progress you've seen on stablecoin legislation, will there be enough Democrats to make this law?
Well, I think FIT 21 was a better name. And in fact, French Hill is the one who named the FIT 21 when it passed last Congress under my chairmanship. And that was his legislation. But I'm not much for congressional naming of bills, frankly. But the bill's a fantastic effort.
Clarity Act. Yeah.
Well, okay, fine. Call it the Clarity Act. But fit for purpose, when we have a fit for purpose regulatory regime, that's what we're going for here. You have a new technology that needs to have a new set of regulation. It is distinct from securities, distinct from commodities, existing laws. And I think this is a very good effort by congressional lawmakers. I think what we're going to see here in the coming month, maybe two, is that you're going to see a merging of the payment stablecoins bill that the Senate is likely to pass next week and a merging of the market structure bill. And I think the president will have one big, beautiful crypto bill on his desk before the fall comes.
But is he making it harder for this to be accomplished because he also has vested interests in crypto and companies that bear his name or his family's involvement is in? This is an issue that Democrats are raising, is potential conflict of interest here.
Doesn't make it easier. And it doesn't make it easier for congressional Democrats to do what they know is solid and real policy work that is necessary for us to have digital innovation and digital assets here in the United States. So I think what you're seeing here in the Senate with the struggle that they have had to pass a payment stablecoin bill, which is not an overly complex bill. It has taken them 3 months to pass the bill and nearly 2 months of wrangling for floor action to pass that bill. And that is because Democratic lawmakers have major concerns about the Trump family activities in the world of digital assets. Now, they're going to overcome that, and I think clarity of law here will provide a rules-based regime for the United States to engage in digital assets, and will clean up a bit of the market dysfunction that we've seen with some of the excesses of crypto over the last decade.
What gets done first, reconciliation or the Clarity Act?
I think it's going to be reconciliation. The backstop here is raising the debt ceiling, and that is why the reconciliation bill has to take precedent. But I think they're going to be able to do both. I think I give them really a better than even shot of getting both done before the end of July, before the August recess.
I hope our viewers and listeners heard that from the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee. I feel like that's tradable.
But like I said, it's going to be a long, hot, nasty, crazy summer here in Washington. Yes, it's going to be fun for us to talk about it.
Yeah.
I miss you all in the studio. This is a very lonely place here in the studio without both of you here.
Thanks for keeping the chair warm. Look, I think we're blessed to know that we will have Patrick McHenry with us for the summer. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Chairman, as always. Bloomberg contributor Patrick McHenry. I just like saying it.
Yes, in addition to all of his other decorated titles,
indeed.
Former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, weighing in on all of the stories we're following today. A meeting between the Fed chair and the president, a president who was called a chicken yesterday and now is faced with a ruling that is stopping some of his tariff ability for now.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We have mobilized at World Headquarters in New York, and it's great to have you with us here. I'm Joe Mathieu on Bloomberg Radio, Satellite Radio Channel 121, on YouTube, where you can find us by searching Bloomberg Business News Live. We're on Bloomberg Originals now as well, and I haven't even talked about the podcast yet. So when we talk about the economy on this broadcast, we tend to reach out to Molly Smith and Stuart Paul. One of them can usually join us, but when we come to New York, we get to have them both. Think of this as like a little economic midday lunch party. We started by talking data, but then we got the ruling on tariffs, and I'm going to put them through the ringer on both of these things. They're good friends of the program, and they help to run our economic coverage on the terminal, online, and yes, on the air. Molly Smith, Bloomberg Economics editor. Stuart Paul, Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist. Nice to see you both in the flesh.
Good to be here.
I want to start with the data, but I really actually need to start by asking you about this tariff ruling, because now nothing matters again, right? Didn't we learn in the Fed minutes this week that nothing matters? Everything's backward looking until Donald Trump decides to speak around 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, he hasn't spoken yet today, so this could all change again. But Stuart, when you heard about this tariff ruling, does this bring us back to zero? Does it mean anything different for the economy? Or is the damage, as some would suggest, already done?
Well, the damage is already done when we're thinking in the rear view. If we're thinking like the Fed and we're trying to anticipate where the economy is going, it provides a little bit of relief. Now, the real question is going to be just how persuaded are businesses and consumers that a relatively low average effective tariff rate is going to stay in effect. Mm-hmm. That's to say, how persistent is the court's ruling going to prove, or is Trump going to try whatever other faculties are available to him to try to re-implement tariffs? And the reason why that matters so much is because the printed data are going to evolve according to how consumers are behaving. And if they think that Trump is still going to continue trying to implement tariffs using whatever other authorities are at his disposal, they're going to pull forward imports once again, as they did in the first quarter. And that's going to actually make the printed data a little bit worse. It's going to make growth a little bit worse. If they think that Trump is going to have to back off in light of the court's ruling, we could actually have a smoother GDP growth trajectory ahead, which puts the Fed a little bit at ease, and it allows the Fed to think maybe those inflation pressures are not going to materialize and they can resume cutting, albeit at a slower pace in the second half of the year.
So, Molly, you guys are twisting yourselves into pretzels to cover data and bring some kind of perspective and context, knowing that most of the time it's backward looking and the whole world has shifted under your feet. The Fed minutes, as I mentioned, were kind of the ultimate example of that. Like, well, policymakers are freaking out about tariffs, but that happened before the pause. So we crinkle that up and throw it away. What do you pay attention to?
I mean, I think like just building on what Stuart said here is that like the whole issue is that the uncertainty of where we go from here is still very much alive. Like, you know, is this trade court ruling the end all be all of what happens? Like, I tend to doubt it. I would think that Trump, like Stuart said, is going to try to do whatever he can to revive tariff policy to the extent that he's trying to. And that, remember, like, this is part of a whole bigger legislative agenda that he's trying to push through. And that with all of these things that are moving through with like the tax bill, a lot of this also depends on there being revenue from tariffs. And the ones right now that the court has blocked would be the ones that would generate the most revenue.
Baseline tariffs.
Those are the big ones.
Yes.
And the bigger reciprocal ones also, all of the ones that are paused right now. So I think right now, if just like you're looking at, you know, has uncertainty been absolved? I would say no. I think it's still very heightened, and who knows how businesses and consumers are going to respond then. So yes, the minutes, of course, incredibly backward looking. I mean, they came out before the pause on China. They came out before, obviously, this court ruling overnight. So who's to say where we go from here? It certainly, I think, would vindicate the Fed. And like, we're staying on pause right now. That really is the best course of action.
Talk about data dependent here. Boy, Stuart, you know, it's interesting. It's like a damned if you do situation, right? The markets freak out. We've got tariffs. Do you know what that's going to mean for inflation? We could have a recession around here, stagflation. You take the tariffs away and the bond market's suddenly upset that we're not raising money to help pay for tax cuts. Which is worse?
I think that it's probably a little bit worse to maintain tariffs in place. What's a little bit tricky is that you read op-eds from Navarro, or you read other sort of analysis that's put out by the West Wing, and they hope to have the big, beautiful bill scored in a way that for some reason incorporates tariff revenue that comes from the West Wing, not from Congress. But this is exactly why tariff revenue and policy from the West Wing, rather than legislation, is excluded from CBO scoring. These are things that can go away with a pen stroke, and whether that's from a trade court judge or the next administration. And when that's the case, the bond market should keep its eye on the legislation. And the legislation right now scores as expanding the deficit by a few $1 trillion.
Yeah.
And for that reason, the bond market should be relatively upset once again that this revenue is going away. It should have always been of the mindset that this tariff revenue could just go away.
So, but Molly, we get Republican lawmakers here every day who say, yeah, but you don't get it. The CBO is wrong. They should have dynamic scoring and factor in the growth that will come from the tax cuts. They're not going to do that. But is there some truth to it?
I mean, look, there is like some truth to the idea of looking at the totality of the policies, sure. But I think when
does that elusive growth, though? That's always the argument for tax cuts. Is it real?
I mean, yeah, how can you really sit here right now and know what that's going to produce? Right. And the tariff effect still is just so fluid. And, even if you are going to get like some bit of revenue from this, I think the argument all along has just been that like it's not going to be sustaining, and that the bond market should rightly focus on that. That like, let's say that this court ruling didn't happen, that you're still going to have these punitive tariffs in place. At some point, people are going to be, stop importing all of this stuff because it's just prohibitively expensive to do so. That revenue is as such going to fall, and they're going to have to find other sources of making these goods. So it's really just not a sustainable source of revenue for the administration to count on or for the bond market to count on.
Well, you know what? I'm going to ask you after this big windup. Now I'm going to ask you to look backward because we do have data to talk about here. I'm pretty sure, Molly, you were on the air with us when we got the first swing at GDP showing the downturn in the quarter. What's new, if anything, in this number?
So the biggest revision to the number today was really just looking at consumer spending, and that accounts for roughly 2/3 of GDP. So that grew at a slower pace in the first quarter than originally reported. That was the biggest takeaway for me, as well as looking at that the trade deficit was actually, or the impact from trade rather to GDP was even bigger than what we initially had seen. Granted, there were some factors that mitigated this, that it ended up being that GDP shrank at a lesser rate than initially reported. But I think like what seems to be the focus more is like these downside revisions to consumer spending and the trade deficit.
So you have a downturn here, Stuart, and you know what the next question is, are we in a recession? Is there one coming? Is this a one-off?
No, we're not in a recession. We are seeing some more precautionary savings on the part of consumers. Remember, though, that the savings rate is still exceptionally low. And so when there is going to be a retrenching of consumer spending, it's likely going to be more material than just a mere slowdown in PCE spending to a 1.2% annualized rate. I think that it is possible that we do see 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, but we still do have reasonably robust domestic final demand. That's to say consumer spending and fixed investment growth. And I think that that's what's more important than the headline GDP figures. We just got jobless claims this morning. Initial jobless claims still tame at about 240,000 for the week that just ended. And even though the labor market is cooling, the unemployment rate remains low. So not quite in a recession, or at least not one that would be judged to be not in an economic environment that would be judged to be a recession by the famous National Bureau of Economic Research.
Yeah, we learned a lot about that when we had the 2 consecutive quarters in the Biden administration, right? And I was schooled. It's not as simple as that. You guys have like 12 boxes to check before this really becomes a recession. So what's on your radar, Molly? Is it the next jobs report? What's going to matter in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, definitely. We've got the next jobs report due a week from tomorrow. And tomorrow we also get a look at April inflation-adjusted spending. So that's going to be a big one to look at, just looking, what's the early indication in the second quarter of how things are panning out. It's, of course, GDP is such like an all-encompassing natural gauge to look at for like, how are we going to talk about the overall health of the economy? But like, as Stuart's talking about here, rightfully so, the trade impact right now is just really, it's really just clouding what like the underlying measures of consumer and business spending would tell you. And those are the right figures to look at right now.
Yeah, interesting. When are we going to see Stewart, the impact in a jobs report of the Doge, the federal worker layoffs, or is that not going to materialize in the hard data?
It's still pretty elusive. We are expecting to see a slowdown in the headline pace of hiring in the May jobs report. We're expecting to see about 90,000 jobs added, in part because of Doge. When you look at the regional economic consequences of the pullback in government spending, the efficiency attempt, it does look to be the case that there are some regional consequences. At the national level, it's a little bit less material, but when it comes to the labor market, uncertainty is the name of the game right now, and we are seeing the consequences of uncertainty, likely with just 90,000 jobs added in May.
Yeah. What a fascinating dive here with you. I feel like we could make money on this, James. Power lunch with Molly and Stewart. We could take this, right? We could sell tickets for this. You guys up for that?
I'm up
Move
for
here
it.
and sign
We
us
could do
up.
this absolutely on the road. Starting at World Headquarters. Thank you both so much. Our two great minds on the economy, Molly Smith and Stuart Paul, helping us understand what's actually happening here in the world and the cross currents that we're all experiencing together. Thank you for a great conversation. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.